The only conclusion this book has is the fact that there is a last page. That is it. Welcome back to the madness. My name is Erin. I'll be your guide today as we delve deep into the depths of the delirium. Today's horror show is The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. And boy, was this novel certainly an experience. So first we're going to look at everything this book has to offer before opening page 1, ending with sort of my overall rating of the execution of this metadata. It's important to examine all of these parts so that we get a better sense as a reader why other readers might or might not be picking this book up. This book was written by Paul Tremblay. Paul. Much like Karen Slaughter, you were kind of born to write suspense and horror thriller with a surname like Tremblay, because it sounds like trembling, and I am glad that you have answered the call to do this in life. You were sort of born with the perfect name. I will be stealing your surname though. I feel like it would be really fun to have a character whose last name is Tremblay and they're very anxious or they're very stoic. Anyways, consider your surname stolen. Oh, you're such a good girl. For whatever you think it's worth, this book did win a Bram Stoker Award. That is an award for horror novels, and I can see how this could have won, even if I disagree, respectfully. Sorry, Paul. This ain't it. Despite it winning a lot of awards and getting nominated for a lot of things, its GOODREADS score is at a very struggling 3.32. So I'm not the only person here that is very confused at the success of what feels like, based on this data set, a mediocre novel. Sorry, Paul. Amy Landon is the audiobook narrator. I listened to this on audiobook. I'm sorry to say, Amy, this was not your best performance. It sounded robotic at times, and it was very difficult to tell characters apart because they all genuinely did sound the same. And part of that is not the narrator's fault. The author needs to make them by word sound distinct, but that plus the fact that the audiobook narrator didn't do as good as a job as I thought, it all just kind of coalesced into an amalgamated mess. Stephen King did blurb this book. I must say that it tricked me into having much higher expectations, because I would think that, like, Stephen King wouldn't blurb a book that wasn't great. I mean, sure, Stephen King has got some books that are not so great and some books that are really, really good. But, you know, he's such a household name that I guess I kind of just deceived myself into thinking that, oh, well, if he blurbed it, then I should probably be fine. But it's definitely the Stephen King that wrote The Mist that blurbed this, and not the Stephen King that wrote Misery, which blurbed this. Because the Stephen King that wrote Misery would never have blurbed this novel. This book does have a movie adaptation. Unfortunately, it got like maybe a 60% on Rotten Tomatoes. So maybe not as good as a movie as I'm hoping. But I don't know. I loved The Mist. What is The Mist on Rotten Tomatoes? A 73. The audience scored 65. Okay, so in terms of our little tomato meter, you know, for however valuable that you think that is, again, some people think it's valuable, some people don't care. They're about the same, so it could be just as good. I'm rambling now. Let's keep going. The movie, by the way, is not called The Cabin at the End of the World. It is called A Knock at the Door, which is objectively a worse title. Why would you name it that? Why would you do that? Why would you ruin such a perfectly good title like that? Excuse me? Excuse me. Why? Leave the titles alone. And speaking of titles, Cabin at the End of the World is amazing. That's an amazing title. It's one of the coolest titles I've heard in a really long time, and it pretty much tracks that some of the best titled books that I've ever heard belong to very mediocre novels. The best title that I have ever heard belongs to the tropiest zombie story that I have ever read. It's no longer the worst book I've ever read. The Dreaming Tree Took That Candle, and I say that with love. Sorry, Matthew Mather, but I do say it with love. But the best title I've ever heard is The Forest of Hands and Teeth. That is such a good title. And The Cabin at the End of the World is also a really good title. I just wish the story was as cool as the title. You know, it's emotionally evocative, and it holds within it apocalyptic promise. We're not really sure if the cabin at the end of the world, with the word at the end of the world, is that a physical location, like the world has ended and this is last bastion, or is this a time? Is it the world is ending and this is the cabin at that point that the world has started to end? You don't really know. And so going into the novel with those kind of questions in mind, you're sort of set out with a mission to kind of figure out what kind of end of the world are we. Is this a physical or a temporal reference? It's temporal. Paul in general is just really good at naming titles. I went on to his GOODREADS, and there are a lot of titles that I really jive with. I feel like I am going to try a few more of his books just to see if this one was a flop. I have not given up on Paul Tremblay. I mean, he's winning awards. Like, I'm willing to believe that there might be a better, I might like one of his other novels. I mean, I read The Dreaming Tree, and then I read Matthew Mather's bestseller, and I get all of my books from the library, so it's not like I'm at any financial loss if I don't like these books. That's the best part about the library, is that I could be like, what if I try and read, I didn't like this book, but what if I read everything else he wrote in hopes that I find something I like? It'll cost you $0 to do that if you use your library card. Go get a library card. It makes you a much bigger risk taker in the way that you read, because you're not sinking $20 to $30 into a book. You just get it for free. And I mean, technically, you did pay for them if you pay taxes. And, you know, like I said with Stephen King, I didn't really love The Mist as a book. It just wasn't very interesting, but I loved Misery. Fun fact about Misery. When I told my mother that I wanted to be a writer, she was like, oh, you should read the book Misery. It's about a writer. She failed to mention that Misery is about a writer who gets kidnapped by an R-rated version of Sierra from Total Drama World Tour.
Oh my gosh, I love you guys, and this is the greatest day of my life, and oh my gosh, Cody! I've dreamt of this moment, only you weren't wearing a shirt.
Thanks, Mom. So the first thing that jumps out at you is the fact that this is sideways. And this is a very effective visual because you are forced to turn your head sideways to look at it. So you're turning sideways, and when you do that, you immediately notice the house. And that's when you realize that the orientation has shifted, and that actually that this is the bottom and this is the top. And these lines, which at first just seem scary, right? This looks like, when you're looking at this kind of just like, these lines kind of just like old pieces, it kind of looks like old wood, right? And then, but when you turn the orientation, you realize these same lines, those are actually trees, and that means this red is the sky. So visually, this this cover is very beautiful. And then, of course, the house down here is blue, which pops out against all of the red. And the little window also helps that all pop out. But I love that the use of, putting Paul's name on the side like this helps us realize that there is an orientation shift. And then, because of the philosophical nature of this book, the perspective shift is sort of a foreshadow, because a lot of this is characters trying to get each other's perspectives to change and to get people to believe things that are very hard sells. And so, like, it is doing some thematic work here with the fact that it is a literal perspective change, and I think that is good. The other cover is from the movie, and it shows Wen with the grasshopper and then the 4 shadows of the 4 guys that show up. And my favorite part about that cover is the shadows and the way that you can see the 4 distinct people, and it feels very ominous, those shadows, against like the little girl holding out the grasshoppers. I do think the cover is cute, and I do think it's very, very effective. I just do prefer this one because I love when perspective is being played with. I love that you have to turn sideways to actually get the picture. I love it. I could not find who did the cover art, but I did run it through an AI detector, so I can tell you that this is most likely human drawn. I'm doing this because I have a degree in creative writing. I'm trying to get published, and I'm in writers groups on Facebook and things like that because I thought that was like a great place to just immerse myself into these communities. And there is so much discourse about AI art covers, and there's a lot of people who are like, no one's even gonna care. Sometimes you can't even tell. So as I'm making these videos, I am doing my due diligence to find the artist who drew the cover, or at the very least, put it through an AI detector for you, so that way I can say with as much assurance as possible that AI art was not involved, and then you can make a active and well-educated spending purchase. I didn't think that this was AI art to begin with because this was published in 2018. I'd never even suspected it. If I want my medium of art, which is writing, to be respected and kept human and to be taken seriously and to not be assaulted by AI, it is my job to also protect the other art forms that are currently under attack by AI. Some of these writers that are like, oh, AI art for your covers are fine, they're not going to be happy when they realize that they're next. They're going to get upset when they realize they're next. It just hasn't quite hit them yet. Are you there, Paul? It's me, Aaron. I want to know who did the art for this book. I would like to name the artist. So I'm on Instagram. I'm at LOHer. Please tell me who did the art, because I would love to know. And if you're not Paul and you happen to see him, please tell him that can you ask him for me who did the art for Kevin at the End of the World? If you just happen to run into him, I would really like to know. Thank you. Okay, so right off the bat, we're going to highlight everything that's sort of jumping out at us. So Wen, Eric, and Andrew, we have Leonard, we need you to help you save the world. And I guess also New Hampshire, okay, yeah. This quote is very memorable. I like it. And it definitely hooks you in because you want to know, well, what does that mean? Love that. And then aside from sort of us getting some character names, some locations, a sort of promise, we get a couple of other facts to help us really set into the atmosphere, like their closest neighbors are more than 2 miles in either direction. We understand that isolation is going to be important. And then down here at the bottom, we have some key words to help us understand sort of what themes we might be exploring. We have paranoia, sacrifice, apocalypse, and then survival. And we get an all of humanity. That's pretty interesting. This part is just plot and in scene and it gives us basically like the frame. It's almost like the frame of the narrative, but not exactly. We understand that this event is going to be dramatized in the story. That's what that middle paragraph is doing, and that is sort of prepping us, the interesting part is what happens after, right? That's the thing that readers are going to be looking at. What I don't like about this, as we're coming in to talk about novel execution, I don't like this section at all. I hate it, in fact. This could just be pure taste on my part, but I don't like the fact that it is in scene. I don't like the fact that we're getting quotes. It's evocative, yes, but it's not informative, and I feel like synopses, they need to be more informative than evocative. Like, save the evocation for the actual novel itself. It's not like a reader is going to not pick up a book because it's not pulling at their heartstrings or emotional enough, right? We understand that this is a bird's eye view, and if we sort of jive with the buzzwords and the concepts and the things being promised, then we're going to pick up the book. Unless you're me. I read this and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be a fan of this, but I read it anyways because I thought the title was really good, okay? That's how you can trick me to read your book, if you work hard and have a really good title, I will ignore every other red flag and still read the book. I also have this problem with men with really nice names. Like, yeah, Demetrius might be an asshole, but his name is Demetrius. I was looking around for a pen. I don't have a pen. The pen is here. This is my pen. Now, let's look at this paragraph. First of all, Paul, if you're here, very important thing to let you know. Your Goodreads page is missing a paragraph, and it's this one. This is the paragraph it's missing. I will show you. I will prove it to you. Look, this is your page, Cabin at the End of the World. It ends with, we need your help. This last paragraph is missing on your Goodreads. Please put the paragraph back where it belongs. I only found this paragraph because I got this book at the library, and so the Wisconsin digital library has this paragraph on there. Please return it to Goodreads. It's the only part of your synopsis that is informative. It's very necessary. And if you're not Paul, please find him. Please tell him to put the paragraph back so that we can be whole again. Unbearably tense? No. Paranoia? Yeah, I would say there's paranoia. Sacrifice? Debatable. Apocalypse? Technically correct. You're technically correct on that one. Survival that escalates to a shattering conclusion? Absolutely not. That is not what happens in this novel at all. The only conclusion this book has is the fact that there is a last page. That is it. And then the fate of a loving family and quite possibly all of humanity are entwined. Again, technically correct, much like the word apocalypse. This last sentence, the cabin at the end of the world, was a masterpiece of terror and suspense from the fantastically fertile imagination of Paul Tremblay. That is someone's subjective opinion, right? I'm not gonna shit on that last sentence because there are people who do think that this book is exactly that. There is 10,000 of them at minimum. And that's impressive, and that is great for Paul. I wish him all the best. I am simply not legion who are many. 'Tis not I. It's a Bible reference for the grandmas in the chat, or a Mass Effect reference if you're a fucking nerd. So I rewrote this synopsis, and I'm not here to say that it is better. I do think it is more informative and can help readers make a better buying decision than what we have here. If I am going to be Paul Tremblay's cheerleader and convince people to read this book, this synopsis would not, I feel like it would not convince an audience. And so I grabbed my pom-poms and I sat down and I rewrote the synopsis, trying very hard to convince readers to read this book, even though I did not like this book at all. 7-year-old Wen and her parents, Eric and Andrew, are vacationing on a remote cabin on a quiet New Hampshire lake. The only thing between them and the rest of humanity is miles of rutted dirt road. After being attacked in a bar and watching the courts fail to do anything meaningful about it, Andrew is excited to be far away from the city and relax with the people he loves most. Nobody expected a stranger up here, let alone 4. They arrive while Wen catches crickets, with eerie kindness on their face and strange weapons in their hands. The whole world comes to a violent halt the moment Wen stumbles into the house and tells her parents that there are people here trying to save the world. You just have to let them in. Thus begins an unbearably tense, gripping tale of paranoia, sacrifice, apocalypse, and survival that escalates to a shattering conclusion, one in which the fate of a loving family and quite possibly all of humanity are entwined. The Cabin at the End of the World is a masterpiece of terror and suspense from the fantastically fertile imagination of Paul Tremblay. So that's the rewritten version. As you can see, the only parts that really got rewritten was that middle section, because that was the only part that was really not working for me. I think mentioning the court case and the Andrew getting attacked in the bar, I think it's Andrew. It could very well be Eric. We'll get into why I can't remember who it is, but I'm pretty sure it's Andrew. And I inserted it here because that is a significant thing that carries throughout the entire story. And I think putting it in the synopsis, the readers are going in looking for information about this court case and looking for it to be explored, right? Putting it in the synopsis is a promise that it's going to be important in the novel itself. And I would say that it is. So, we're getting a promise for readers, and that might convince them to pick it up. I also wanted to use language like the rest of humanity and the whole world because this novel is about the apocalypse, and then we're also emphasizing over and over again that this place is isolated. And in the original, we end with Leonard talking about how Wen's parents have to let them inside, and that Leonard is trying to save the world, and I wanted to make sure that was included in the revision, so that's why we're still ending with the people here trying to save the world, you just have to let them in. I wanted to make sure that that energy was still there, because obviously when Paul Tremblay was writing this synopsis, he thought that that was very important and something that will catch the reader and pull them in, so I wanted to make sure that was included. So now that we're done examining this book at every angle, like it's an item in Resident Evil that will somehow get us access to the shotgun, let's actually open up this book and see what's inside. The prose was fine until we started jumping chaotically between first and third person. And I don't know if this is a style thing that got lost with it being an audiobook, but it was very distracting and it didn't translate well. If your book is stylized in such that it wouldn't translate well to an audiobook, you probably just shouldn't do an audiobook. I don't think you could ever do House of Leaves as an audiobook because that would be a nightmare. How could you even do that? But I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what a physical copy looks like. For all I know, it is just this weird pitching between first and third person right at the end. It doesn't start until like the very last chapter, which is very confusing. I was upset that I was rating it so low because the prose itself up until like the very last chapter was fine. I was understanding everything. I was engaged enough. So I was like, I'll probably rate this prose very high even if I'm rating this book very low. And then that happened and I'm like, well, shit. I think that this book could have benefited from third-person ventriloquism. So if Tremblay wanted a more intimate voice, then third-person ventriloquism would be the place to go. That term was coined by George Saunders when he wrote 10th of December. And it's basically using the psychic distance and the familiarity of first person in third person. I think that would have been a better choice rather than this switch between first and third, because this book also has perspective changes. And so when we are jumping between characters and then jumping between first and third person, I don't know who's talking at any given time. And that's not a good look. So psychic distance is how far the reader feels from the events of the story. Third person usually has a more objective view than first person. First person tends to feel more personable. And honestly, when it comes to writing horror, especially psychological horror, you typically want to be as psychically close to the main character as possible. You want us to kind of wonder if they're an unreliable narrator, because part of psychological horror and horror is not knowing what is true and not knowing what is real. And this story's idea is good. I think the idea is good. I think that the changes in perspective and then this POV from first to third sort of holds it back. Like, I think if this story would have been just told from Andrew's point of view, he's the one who gets attacked in a bar, that would have been fine. He, in my opinion, has the most interesting backstory, and because he calls into doubt the validity of events, he is a better set of eyes for the reader than any other character, because we think he is the most objective. Emphasis on think. But at the same time, you could also interpret his objectivity as simply denial of the supernatural, thus rendering him an unreliable narrator. And that's something that can be left ambiguous, and it works. And I'm mentioning ambiguous that works because Paul Tremblay tries to do a lot of ambiguous endings and open-ended storytelling, and almost all of it fails. But if you just told it from Andrew's perspective, and then the question is Andrew the smartest one who is inherently objective because he is casting doubt, or is Andrew in denial because he cannot comprehend the supernatural? That's an interesting discussion to have. That is an interesting open-ended sort of answer that I wish we could have had, that we don't. So critics say this book could have been a great short story, and I agree. This book did not need to be 9 hours. 9 hours long. He's dying. He just died because I told him that this book was 9 hours long. I don't know where the top... Are you going to float all the way to the stratosphere? Okay. I got you. He's back. I think another thing that is holding this story back from really great, good potential is the fact that it is simply too long. And in terms of timeline, not a lot of stuff is happening. This makes me miss the year of the witching, because it was so fast-paced, and every sentence something new was happening, and it was really good. And in this book, it's like nothing happens for 40 straight pages. The first act is set up and break-in. We get a sense of the setting, and then we drive straight into Leonard showing up, and Leonard and Team Leonard, there's 4 of them, and they will forever be known as Team Leonard, and then, which consists of Leonard, Redmond, Sabrina, and, do you remember her name? Adrian. And then Team Andrew is going to be when Andrew and Eric, the family. So Team Leonard shows up, and they very politely, forcibly break into the cabin. And that is basically our first act. And it's not very long, and I would not say that it needs to be longer, but it's fairly short. And so you would think that the next 2 acts would be equally as short, because there can't be that much going on, and there's not, but it drags. So Act 2 is rinse and repeat of, like, Team Leonard saying, choose someone to die. And then Team Andrew says, no, go fuck yourself. One of Leonard's gang dies instead. And this happens twice over the course of several reading hours in this act. And then, in the third act, that begins after Wen gets shot. But we still keep doing this, like, choose someone, no, then one of us dies thing. That happens 2 more times in the third act. So by the time, so this cycle happens 4 times total. And then finally, it's just Eric and Andrew left, and then we don't know if Eric kills Andrew to stop the apocalypse, or if Andrew successfully convinces Eric that the apocalypse isn't real. That is left for us as the reader to decide. The problem that this plot runs into is that there's only one narrative loop possible, and because it repeats 4 times, it gets stale. And all of this is for the sake of this ambiguous ending. But if you got rid of the ambiguous ending, which needs Eric and Andrew to both be alive at the end with no one else left alive, if you get rid of that, then we have a lot of open access to more narrative loops beyond the one that happens 4 times in a row. This is the loop in its entirety. Team Leonard says choose someone to die. Team Andrew says no. Someone from Team Leonard dies. This death does not count. Someone turns on the TV to prove that the world is ending. Team Andrew refuses to believe that this is true, and the cycle begins again. That is the narrative loop that we're stuck in. And if you're wondering, hey Aaron, you've said this like 3 to 4 times now. I know. Imagine that being your reading experience. Wouldn't you go insane? And when objectively is the most interesting variation of this narrative loop, because she does get shot, but she falls under this death doesn't count in that narrative loop because it ultimately doesn't count. And much like Wen's parents, I think this is stupid. But in order to get Andrew and Eric alone for this like open-ended finale, Wen has to die, and it can't count. Leonard killing Wen is a good way to accomplish this, and it might have worked if Wen was not a part of this repetitive narrative loop. Like, the clever way that Tremblay got around this was well thought out. It's just not interesting because we have seen this happen time and time again. I think after Wen dies, if Eric and Andrew just, like, slaughtered everyone as a result, I think that it could have been a great way to end it. You would have cut out a third of this story, but I can't really recall major details from that last third that well, and I finished reading this book 3 days ago, and I haven't even started a new book. If they chose to end it like that, like one dies, Aaron and Andrew go on a rampage, they kill everyone, you could still get it at the end where they have to decide whether or not this is real or that's not. And I'm not sure if the idea would work because I am just spitballing and I'm not like putting the idea to page. If I could revise this book, I would try to see if that sort of an ending would work. It would be a much shorter novel, but I think it would be effective. So I had to go digging through the GOODREADS reviews to find which dad was Catholic and which one was the one who got attacked in the bar. And I'm not 100% sure that they are 2 separate characters. I'm hoping that they're 2 separate characters and I do not look like a fool through the entirety of this video. I would say that it's not completely my fault that I cannot tell these characters apart. Paul has some responsibility in this. Paul, sir, why is the last paragraph of your synopsis missing on GOODREADS? So Eric and Andrew do not feel very distinct from one of each other. These are the 2 dads. And so I often got confused of whom was whom, and then the fact that we are always getting many multiple perspective shifts, and then at the very end we are shifting between first and third person does not help make them feel distinct in any meaningful way. But again, this is not from a lack of trying. You know, at times it felt like these were just like 2 voices that are there for the sake of having a dialogue for the events of the world, and that they're not necessarily distinct from each other because of how often I was confused as to who was who. You know, at the end of the novel, they don't necessarily feel like characters. It's more like I've been transported into the world of Life is Strange, and I'm being told I either need to sacrifice the town to save one person, or I need to sacrifice one person in order to save the... Wait. Is this just Life is Strange? All jokes aside, in Life is Strange, Chloe and Arcadia Bay are reduced to the philosophical problem that Max has to confront, which is, do you sacrifice the few to save the many? And likewise, Eric and Andrew are reduced from characters to that same problem with an ambiguous ending that basically, it's like the book ends and then you get like the screen of like, pick Andrew or pick Eric. If you pick Andrew, or if you're a Life is Strange fan, if you would have picked Chloe, you've basically chosen to save the few regardless of the many, and you head into the unknown, unsure if you're going to make it to the next sunset, but you and your loved ones are both alive, and that's all that matters. And then if you picked Eric, or if you played Life is Strange, if you picked Arcadia Bay, Eric kills Andrew, and presumably the world does not end. It's the exact ending of Life is Strange. Almost to a T. And Cabin at the End of the World fails the same way that Life is Strange does. It's very obvious what the objectively correct answer is in both Life is Strange and Cabin at the End of the World, because the storytelling and the world building do not have a very strong foundation for the other option. Aside from cowardice on the player's part, or pure selfish intention, or perhaps just wanting to know what happens if you pick Chloe. You know, you save your husband and you save your lover, but that doesn't fucking matter because you're not going to live long enough to be able to enjoy it. What makes this worse is that I couldn't keep straight who was Andrew and who was Eric. That did not help. And as I said, I had to look through the GOODREADS reviews to figure out which husband belonged to which backstory, because I didn't want to be wrong, but there's a possibility that the guy who gets attacked at the bar and the guy who is Catholic is the same person. I'm not entirely sure. Adrian and Sabrina were likewise interchangeable. I think Sabrina was a nurse, but I could not tell you a single detail about Adrian. I don't even know if Adrian spoke. The only characters that felt truly and genuinely distinct were Leonard and Redmond, because Leonard and Redmond were supposed to be like dramatic foils or complete opposites, so their personalities were pretty distinct from each other, and the way that other characters viewed them and like talked about them in their own internal monologues were very distinct, so they were easy to tell apart. And then Gwen is easy and distinct because she is the only child. Dialogue felt natural, but voices tended to meld together. It lacks distinction at times. The audiobook narrator's mediocre performance did not help this. As I said before, Renard and Ledman? Did I also say Renard? Renard and Ledman. Those sound like superheroes that ended up on the cutting room floor in Stanley's office. Redmond and Leonard have the most distinct voices, probably because they're supposed to be completely opposite from one another. Leonard is like this tall, wholesome giant who doesn't want to be there but understands that he must, and Renard is this like creepy, evil little man that enjoys this way too much. The physical environment feels real and succeeds in making characters feel trapped and isolated, but because the author loathed the idea of confirming core details, the thematic atmosphere stalls and falls short of expectations. So I feel isolated and I feel trapped, but I don't feel like I'm being psychologically tormented. I don't feel the horror in a way that I feel like I should be, and I don't feel as stressed as I feel like I should be. Like, I acknowledge that, like, oh yeah, they're alone and this is scary, and they're isolated and this is scary, but I'm not, like, worried. Here is a list of details that don't get confirmed in this story, and they're gonna drive you insane. We don't know whether Redmond whether or not Redmond is the guy who attacked Andrew in the bar. There is active intervention on the part of the author, which is very obvious, to make this discovery impossible, including Eric just not believing Andrew's claims 100%. We don't ever find any ID on the guy, and the guy who attacked Andrew and Redmond even had different names. It's just something that's left ambiguous for no reason at all. We don't get a confirmation whether or not Gwen is dead after she gets shot. We're 99% sure that she is, but there's I swear to God, Sabrina is a nurse, and there's a part where she's like, man, I should probably check her pulse and things like that, but I don't. It's bro, why did you make her a nurse? What, why don't you just say that you already shot her, Paul? Just tell us that she's dead. We don't know whether or not there's an actual apocalypse going on. This is the main philosophy that the book wants to discuss, and we'll get into detail in a little bit. But not a single detail about this alleged end of the world is confirmed to be true or false. Not a single detail about this apocalypse, and we get so many details. But every single time, it's do you think that part was real? Do you think that part was fake? Am I on, Dora the Psychological Horror Explorer, where she's can you find the answer? Do you think it's fake? What? And then we don't get a confirmation on which apocalypse is happening, if any. It feels like a Christian one, and that's the one that we lean the most into, but we never get a confirmation onto which apocalypse specifically is happening, if it is a specific one to a religion at all, or an apocalypse that sort of exists in the cultural mindset of our world, like a zombie apocalypse. We don't get a confirmation as to what kind of apocalypse at all. It's insane how much we don't get confirmation for. And because we don't get any confirmation on any of these details in any meaningful way, we cannot submerge ourselves into the thematic atmosphere of this book. I am just as confused and frustrated as a pick-me work wife at her bestie's wedding. Speaking of pick-me, if a book could be a pick-me, it would be this book. I'm sorry, Paul. If you thought this review was already rough and critical, strap in, because you're on the Cyclone roller coaster in Uranium City. It's only gonna get worse from here. By the way, I must mention here that Paul Tremblay is an award-winning successful author, and I am simply just starting to quarry. Paul does not care what I have to say. He has copious amounts of success. I'm able to be this critical because he can obviously handle it. I always feel when I'm very critical about books that I'm afraid that these authors think I hate them. And no, I don't. There are very few authors that I don't like. I never go into a book being wow, I'm gonna hate this. I'm you know that scene in Star Wars?
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
That's how I feel when I go into a book and then I don't end up liking it. I'm you were the chosen one! No! It's a very sad day for me. Hi, Echo. Bow. Bow. Gonna hang up by the microphone? Your best friend, the microphone? Thematically, this book feels like it was attempting to be incredibly deep and emotionally complex and designed to be discussed. But in this attempt, Paul refuses to confirm any core details, to leave it up to interpretation, but when you examine the story carefully, there is really no solid argument for there not being an apocalypse. because then the story fundamentally stops making sense. The story and its theme is sort of stuck in a state of limbo as a result. It feels like this novel will do whatever it takes to become your book club's next read. That's why it's like, pick me, I'm high art and I'm provocative and I have lots of interesting questions, pick me. That's what this book energy is. But it fails when you kind of put it under scrutiny because it feels like that its focus was to be talked about, that the story itself is placed second to the idea of a discussion at a book club. Let's go back to Life is Strange for a moment. The emotional turmoil of that final choice is entrenched in the philosophical question, will you sacrifice the few to save the many? And subjectively, poor foundational work and writing aside, this sort of existential question can be picked apart and pulled and dissected, and I definitely don't love Life is Strange, but at the same time, I do love Life is Strange. It's frustrating, but I still want to keep talking about it. I think about Life is Strange more often than I should for a game that I'm not entirely sure that I even liked. Which means that for all that it's doing wrong, it's still doing enough right. Now let's look at Misery. So Misery is a horror novel where a man, who's also named Paul, is kidnapped and held hostage by a fangirl because she wants him to keep writing her favorite novel series. And she torments Paul physically and psychologically to get this outcome. The emotional turmoil of that situation is us wondering how Paul is going to get out of there alive. And what sort of things might he have to sacrifice along the way in order to get out. The cabin at the end of the world's inability to pick a fucking lane means we cannot fully lean into the emotional turmoil of these options in any full or meaningful way. Our feet are in different ponds, but both of these ponds are shallow. Because in order to really delve deep into these two different brands of horror, you have to confirm some details along the way so we know how we're supposed to be frightened. If we're not really sure what we're supposed to be scared of, and we're not really sure what is the dread, again, we're just kind of confused. And I don't think that's the outcome that Paul wants. What do you want, Paul? And finally, things happen to these characters, but characters never do anything. Everyone is always reacting, and everyone's hand seems to be forced. Nobody seems to be wanting to do any of the things that they are doing. It makes everyone lack a sense of agency, like they're not really in the driver's seat of their own story, and no character makes a single choice. And the novel itself does not decide on anything. If Purgatory were a book, it would be this one. This is a small detail. So, what kind of apocalypse is never confirmed, but we do get a sense that it's probably Christian. I think that Team Leonard's 4-man team is supposed to be the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but I couldn't tell you who is supposed to be which horseman. And the 4 horsemen, that's like my special interest, my thing. The thing that I am very passionate about is the 4 horsemen. I get upset every time Pestilence is named as the first horseman because Conquest is actually the first horseman. And like, I get it. I get why some people do creative differences, but I think Conquest is pretty cool. And I don't know why we're changing his name. Why does everyone hate Conquest? Like, in actuality, if this is Revelation, the biblical apocalypse, Team Leonard fits better not as the 4 horsemen, but as the 2 witnesses. The 2 witnesses are these 2 prophets who foretell the end days, and they cannot be killed during this time, but will eventually be killed by dogs, and the people will celebrate, thereby implying that the people will not believe the 2 witnesses and their proclamations of the end days. They'll be celebrating because they will no longer have to hear these prophets spouting off that the world is ending. And then eventually the 2 witnesses will resurrect, come back to life, scare the shit out of everyone in the process, and then enter heaven. I love the two witnesses in biblical revelation. I think they're just as interesting as the four horsemen. There's a lot of interesting narrative happening with them, and Team Leonard feels closer to the witnesses than they ever really do feel towards the horsemen, because they come with a prophecy that humanity doesn't believe, humanity being Team Andrew. But we don't lean enough into biblical apocalypse in the story itself to understand that this story is a retelling of the two witnesses, or even a retelling of the four horsemen. And in terms of common knowledge, most people know who the four horsemen of the apocalypse is. That's pretty common knowledge. If someone is to know something about biblical revelation, it's usually the four horsemen. And less people know about, like, the two witnesses, or the Whore of Babylon, or the woman with the crown of 12 stars. You know, but Eric is Catholic, so if there was a character who could reasonably recall nuanced information about Revelation, it would be him. And honestly, I think it could be a really funny and interesting argument if my name's Aaron, if Eric and Andrew were arguing whether or not Team Leonard were the two witnesses or the four horsemen. You don't have to answer which ones they are. That's a good spot where you can leave something open-ended, whether or not you think they're the two witnesses or if you think they're the four horsemen. Now that we've thoroughly roasted this novel into abject oblivion, let's take a step back and get a bird's eye view of what I think worked, what sort of worked, and what didn't work. So what worked for me was the action. When characters are moving, panicking, reacting, the suspense is very good. Like, I feel panicked when Andrew and Eric are trying to block all of the exits. That was a stressful situation. I think the strongest part of the novel is it's not the moment Leonard shows up and is like, let us in. It's the moment when Team Leonard starts trying to break in, up to them breaking in. That section was probably the strongest section in the novel, which is good because you need that section to work well, because if that section doesn't work well, it doesn't bode well for the novel. Whenever Team Andrew is panicking, the fear feels very real. Every moment when Team Andrew is thinking of exits, deciding what choices they need to make, how to get Wen out alive, Eric and Andrew are often discussing which one of them will get left behind if only one of them can get Wen out. Like, the panic is very real and it's very well written, and I was panicking with them. You know, when I said that, like, the atmosphere, the isolation, and the terror, like, that is real, these are the parts that I'm talking about. Wen is a realistic child. And I know what you're thinking. Why is that on a list of things that work, Aaron? Go read The Scarlet Letter and come back to me, and you'll understand why I think it's important to mention if a child is written like a child. Because Pearl is a small, weird adult. That is how my high school teachers described Pearl. Wen has a major meltdown when she realizes her crickets might be dead, which is a very dramatic and emotional moment. You know, when it comes to traumatic experiences and this sort of way you process it afterwards, the shock, not medical shock, but there's just how you process the event. You can't really control what your brain kind of latches onto. You just sort of latch onto something. For example, my house was raided by police, and the things that I remember vividly are not the things that you would expect. I don't really remember waking up. I don't remember being told whose fault it was, even though I was told. But I remember the name of my cousin's friend's girlfriend who slept over that night. And I remember everything she said. She asked if she could hug her boyfriend. The cop said no. She did this awkward little wave, and then I never saw that girl again. Why do I remember that? Because I had this little sign of her name that I painted and was supposed to give to her. And because her name is a noun, that sign made it to my mom's house, and everyone thought it was just like a live, laugh, love sign because, this girl's name was just also a noun. And I just never told anyone that it was for her. That's my best guess as to why I remember with distinction this girl. But other major parts of that day, gone. So when we're writing characters experiencing just coming off the aftermath of bad news or a traumatic experience, experiencing a mental shock, again, not medical shock, feels more real when they're not when characters are not fixated on the traumatic experience itself, but something that feels incorrect to be hyper-focused on, or something that's entirely mundane. You'll see this a lot in workplace dramas like Grey's Anatomy and Criminal Minds, where, you'll have characters who are not reacting or grieving the correct way. In Wen's case, her family is in the middle of this psychological and physical torment and is possibly going to be destroyed, but she is worried about the crickets. And really what that is Wen finally coming to terms with the danger of the situation and her just going into a full-blown panic. She's worrying about it because it's something that can be solved versus the situation at hand, which she and her little 7-year-old brain has no idea how to solve. It's very interesting. There's a lot to discuss about why Wen cries about her crickets. There's good discussion there, and people can have any number of interpretations. That's just my interpretation. And that is where this novel is good. There are moments that I loved. So what sort of worked? The philosophical question at the end, I can't really say that it didn't work. I think it just kind of sort of worked. It just needs to pick one. There's a lot of potential, but because this novel does not want to confirm anything, I don't know what philosophical question I'm really asking. The ambiguous ending, it sort of worked. I can see what Paul was trying to do, but there are just so many small things that at the end just made this choice struggle. And then what didn't work is not confirming any single detail, and then the workarounds to prevent confirming any of these details. It was very obvious. The author hand was very visible in these moments. Are you playing with the ribbon? The length of the story didn't work for me. This could have been a great short story or novella, but definitely not a novel. The multiple perspectives gave us too much of an objective view of the situation, and a lot of insider knowledge about the nature of these events, and I think it didn't work for me at all. I think we really would have benefited from a first-person perspective so that we could question the reliability of whichever narrator that we would have gotten. My personal fave for a first person would be Andrew, but getting this entire story from Wen's perspective would also be interesting, because then you would have to be like, Wen is a child and she understands things as a child, so like you as the adult reader have to like really read between the lines to really understand what is going on, and that could be psychologically and interesting. Again, I really think that there are just a few things that hold this novel back, and I'm not the only one who thinks this. I just want to put that reminder on that it does have a 3.3 on Goodreads, so I am not alone in this. Sometimes knowing how not to do something is just as helpful as knowing how to do something. I don't think Paul Tremblay wants me to recommend this book as a cautionary tale of what not to do, but that is all I could feasibly recommend for this as a case study. And look, no, I don't think any book wants to be recommended as an educational case study of what not to do. I don't think that anybody wants that, but unfortunately, some books are just going to be that. And I think, it's still a teachable moment, and I think that's a nice consolation. I mean, this is also art and very subjective. There are lots of people who loved this novel. This novel won an award, so obviously, what worked for you might not work for me, and what might not work for me might work for you. Right? Some people don't know, truly how a story could fundamentally change if you do multiple perspectives or one perspective, or if you do third person versus one person. So I think if you wanted to know how a story can be really hindered by the perspective that is chosen, this is a novel to read. The queer representation is good. I think if you wanted to case study the queer representation, this is a good book to do that. It's very casual queer representation in that there are queer characters, and even though like technically it is queer suffering, it's not necessarily queer suffering because Eric and Andrew are gay, and I liked that. I think if you wanted a case study, Children Under Duress, When is a pretty good example. The cricket okay, stop eating the ribbon. This is night. I know that my room is a Joanne Fabrics, but that does not mean everything is a snack. I think if you wanted a case study, Children Under Duress, When is a really good example. The cricket meltdown is probably one of the best parts of the book and one of the most emotional scenes in the book because it's not shrouded in this soup of ambiguous questions. Okay, having an open-ended ending or moments left up to the reader is not a bad thing to have in a story. The Giver is a great book. But I would say that this book chooses to leave too many things ambiguous. You know, how can a story be hindered by not confirming details? What would that look like? This is a good story to case study as a cautionary tale. No author wants to be recommended as a cautionary tale, and in my opinion, though, these are some of the most helpful books because I am someone who learns better at what not to do than what to do. I am way better at knowing what I don't want to be as a person than I know what I do want to be as a person. It's just the thing that makes sense to me. So as much as I am very saddened to be recommending it in this sort of a way, I will say that, you know, as a reader, maybe I wasn't as entertained, but as a writer, I find that this book is very useful. Art is subjective. This won awards, and people did rate it 5 stars, right? There are people who think that this is artistic genius, and they're correct. And I don't think it's really much of anything, and I'm correct, because that is just the nature of art. Alright, it's time to indulge me. So, my favorite part of Goodreads are the book tags. My tags are funny and hyper-specific and do not help anyone at all. But I love them, so we're going to see what I tagged this book as. First, I tagged this book as 2024 and did not like. I obviously did not have a phenomenal experience, but despite this, I'm not quite ready to abandon Paul. I haven't given up on you, Paul. I am going to read more of your books because I am confident that I might like another one. I feel like I could love another one of your books. This book is tagged under Live, Laugh, Lobotomy because this book is going to put me in a psych ward for how insane, not a compliment, this book is. It's so insane, in fact, that I don't have any proper words to describe this madness other than Live, Laugh, Lobotomy. I want one after reading this. I've also tagged this under religion-y because there are religious elements. Eric is Catholic. The biblical apocalypse feels like Revelation. I don't know if we're doing Four Horsemen or Witnesses. And then finally, I tagged this book under Uncomfortable Obsession, which is reserved for books that include a weird or creepy obsession between two characters or a character and an object. Leonard's fixation on Wen often made me feel uncomfortable. There's no weird subtext or anything going on. It's not a thematic thing. It's just, I didn't like it. I wanted Leonard to leave her alone. It was really weird, and it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Please take 10 steps back before I call CPS. Despite my disdain for this novel, what works for me might not work for you and vice versa. And so to help the right audience find this book and give Paul all the love and praise that I wish I could have given him, here is my list. If you like anything on this following list, you might like Cabin at the End of the World, and I would recommend that you read it. Number 1, the movie Hush. The book or the movie The Mist. Philosophy, open-ended stories, the game Life is Strange, queer representation in horror, thematic insanity, the movie Ready or Not, and if you'd like Nostradamus prophecies, you'll probably like this book. Art is subjective, and attempting to assert any form of objectivity onto art is simply a waste of time. You can't even say that good grammar is an objective must-have because there are genres where fragmentation is important and there are audiences for those genres. I think everyone wants to have high-quality novels. We all just have drastically different thresholds of what we consider a high-quality novel. So whether you loved this book so much that you are willing to die on this hill, or it is a book that you hated with the passion of 1,000 suns, I would love to know. Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your interpretation. If you thought your time was well spent, please like. You might even want to subscribe because I am this maddening and obsessive about every single book I read. As of now, the madness is ended. You can go in peace, and we will see you next time when we delve into the delirium. I don't need a bath, okay? I'm clean. I took a shower. Y'all have a good night.